Hi, Grant.
Ghana, it's excellent to see you.
Great to see you too. Can you just tell people who you are?
Grant Burrow. I've really worked for the past 15 years at the intersection of digital, experimentation, products, personalisation, and really behavioural science. And so some of the light bulbs that I had kind of came in 2016, 2017 when I started working with behavioural science team and had a ton of light bulbs. So that really changed the direction of my career.
Brilliant. I know you also recently did a degree in behavioral science, right?
Did a master's. Did a master's in behavioural economics at UTS.
Oh, brilliant. So
I really took some of the things that I'd been seeing and working with a bunch of teams at CBA at the time and had the red pill moment. You think about the Matrix and when Neo has this moment of, does he have the blue pill and go back to seeing the way the world was, or does he have the red pill and see this whole different world? And so for me, I took the red pill and away I went.
Well, I will ask you some questions about that, but maybe let's start with behavioral science in organizations. So do you think it actually delivers customer value, and how can we ensure that it does?
What do you think, Ghana? I'd be interested in your view. I've been fortunate to share at a lot of organizations, and I give a bunch of examples, some of which are publicly available that I've shared. But I really make this point that whether you like it or not, or aware of it or not, or doing it well or not, that behavioural science is actually everywhere. And I call on, there are zillions of examples, but think about an organisation like Qantas. They've got symbolic rewards. Think about the loyalty program, this idea around media maximisation and what's going on there. You think about a telco, for example, the way they present their plans and context effects and decoys. So the examples are everywhere. And so decisions are being made, but organizations typically aren't aware of what they are doing or how to harness that to drive the outcomes that they want. So absolutely. One of the things that I speaking about and have reflected on is that there are very few things as important as this combination of outcomes, experimentation, and behavioural science. And part of the reason for that, we can kind of delve into this, is that what organisations are really good at is having scale and customers. And what academia is good at is having theory and accurate measurement. And rarely do the two meet. And so when you apply behavioural science, it forces you to really think through what's the outcome we're trying to drive here and how do we effectively measure it to make sure that it's working. And one of the things that I've found is that most organizations don't tend to do that in an accurate way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that. So we obviously have all these people in organizations who are measuring things.
Yes, they are measuring things, yep.
And then, we have academics who are more interested in the why. And usually there is behavioral science unit or behavioral insights unit in organizations who actually are these are basically folks who are also interested in the why.
Yep.
So how much of this why do you actually, need for business outcomes? Because from my experience, I don't know about yours, a lot of behavioral science in organizations boils down to just nudging people to do something. And very often, I don't mean the organizations you worked for, but some organizations I know, some organizations I know, they effectively just, do quite, atheoretical stuff. So they don't actually have any hypothesis before they go into experimenting on,
I think you're right. I mean, one of the things that part of the journey that I had is really leading teams that would drive sales, service, retention, all the things that drive measurable outcomes, revenue impact, cost reduction. And so what tends to happen in organizations is that something like experimentation gets done in digital sales teams who will do what you described. They'll do testing of button colors or adding a descriptor, and they will do some rudimentary stats, and they'll get some kind of result, and then they'll extrapolate it in a way that probably doesn't warrant it. And so one of the light bulbs that I had working with academics in kind of 2016, 2017 is we applied this theory around transparency. And Ryan Buell at Harvard's done a whole bunch of work around transparency, all sorts of different types of transparency. And we did this work around trade-off transparency. Essentially, the theory is if you talk about the bads as well as the goods, then it helps customers to make better decisions because they're able to better match their preferences with the product or service that they're getting. Long story short, we ran this publicly available experiments where we showed not just the features and benefits of credit card products, but also the trade-offs. What was really interesting is that my intuition is that this would lead to higher confidence, which would lead to higher acquisition. And what do you think happens, Gunnar?
I don't know, short-term effects, I guess.
What was interesting is it turns out that I was wrong, but I was wrong for pretty profound reasons. And so typically, when most organizations, even if they did have a theory, they would roll it out, they'd look at digital metrics, they'd see there's no difference really to conversion, and they would say, it did no harm, let's roll it out. But actually we did something different, which is we robustly measured it through to a ton of offline metrics as well. So retention and spend, and we found an 18% incremental increase in retention for customers that had seen the trade-offs and a 12.5% incremental increase in usage or spend. And so if you compare that to just a I forget the terminology used, but just some intuition-led random idea around we're going to shift some things around, what it gave us is we had a strong prediction. We also could measure it through to offline metrics, which really matter. And then we could start to scale it as well. So we actually had a theory of the world, which meant that you don't just need to confine it to one area, but you can then start to scale it to a ton of other products as well. So for me, that was a light bulb. And so that's where I think a lot of organizations can learn from academia. They've got a strong theory. Now, sometimes they're wrong, but at least that theory gives them something directional. The other thing is that it ends up being predictive. It's very easy. I do this exercise where I'll explain to an audience that an organization introduced a change to a process. And I say, this is the result that occurred. Why did that occur? And typically there are like 5 or 6 excellent reasons they come up with. They'll say the symbols work better, or we've got, it's much more intuitive, and so we have these great reasons. Then I tell them, actually, the result was the opposite. And I lied to you. And I'm simply illustrating the point that when we get a set of data as humans, we've got this hindsight bias, we can explain anything away. So if you don't have a strong theory with strong kind of predictive power, then you can start to believe anything, and all of a sudden these false ideas have a way of growing in an organization.
Yeah, so you can basically justify pretty much anything.
Totally,
yeah?
justify anything. I can justify anything.
Yeah, I have a colleague who did this experiment with kind of showing people 2 photographs. One photograph is kind of, I guess, of a person much more attractive than the other.
Yep.
But then they would ask, like, who do you find more attractive? People would choose one of these photos, and then they would swap them.
Yep.
And show them the other photo, and they would ask to justify. And I think like 85% of people actually justify their own photo that they didn't pick.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think where this becomes really important is organizations have good intentions. They spend a lot of money, and resources are always scarce. And putting aside experimentation, behavioral science, which really helps to elevate it. One of the studies have found this, plenty of studies to cite, but also intuitively in working with a ton of organizations, 50 to 90% of things don't drive the intended outcome. And this occurs largely everywhere. So if you don't know, if you're not accurately measuring whether the investment you're rolling out is driving the intended outcome, then you're potentially losing tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And so just the ability to accurately measure, did this thing drive the intended outcome, is really, really critical. And that then forces you to say, well, what is the outcome we're trying to drive? And I mean, I'd be interested in your experience. In a lot of ways, some of the biggest barriers that exist for an organization is trying to define what success looks like. There's an intuitive layer where you can describe it, but when you are trying to metricate it, it becomes much more challenging. So one of the examples that I give is that most organizations want to try and drive an incremental increase in digital engagement, which makes sense. And I'll talk about this. I'll say digital engagement's good. Most organizations will have digital engagement as a metric, and they typically define it as something like unique logins, unique daily logins over the month, and you want to increase that. And the intuition is that if you increase that, then that will lead to
some measurable,
some kind of measurable thing.
Yeah.
Which is typically like when you think about it, it'll be increased usage leads to increased retention, increased product holdings, increased advocacy, etc. There's some publicly available study which showed the relationship between digital engagement and financial well-being. And what do you think it showed? What do you think the relationship between digital engagement and financial well-being was?
None.
Interesting. It showed actually the intuition is if you increase digital engagement, will lead to increased financial well-being.
Okay.
However, and to it's interesting. I like the way you split the dilemma that I gave and said there is none. It turned out that it's actually inverse.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So customers with the highest digital engagement have the lowest financial well-being. So theoretically, I say tongue-in-cheek, if you wanted to increase the amount of digital engagement, just go get 1 million customers with very low financial well-being.
Mm-hmm. But maybe it's also, but it's like, how do you know the cause? Sorry to interrupt, but
no, please.
How do you know the cause and effect? Because I would just say that's like I don't know, some prospect theory type of people that Danny Kahneman told us about, right? That if you're checking your financial position, frequently, probably your financial well-being goes down. Like you don't feel very, very
absolutely.
good.
And so for me, I think there are some really profound insights, and the first one is that the way that digital engagement is defined is fairly rudimentary. Mm-hmm. And so probably what's happening is that customers with the lowest financial well-being are scared, they're anxious about their money, so they log in frequently. And so where this plays out is organizations will have a KPI to drive digital engagement. But in that case, to drive digital engagement is actually a bad indicator of what's going on. So what I would say is think about what does good digital engagement really look like, and how do you try and encourage that? So is it usage of tools in a meaningful way that drives some kind of surplus in savings, a whole bunch of things that can be worked through there. But then the other thing to your point is this is an observational kind of stat. The question is, can you meaningfully drive some kind of change in behavior which will increase a cohort's financial well-being over time? Mm-hmm. And how do you do that? And so that's the difference between like an observational metric and some kind of causal activity. And that's really what most organizations are trying to do, but they may not be.
Yeah, I like how I know you are experimentation guru, so you preemptively killed a couple of questions that I was going to ask you about
thank you.
Measurement and other things.
Yeah.
Yes. So, I guess what I'm going to ask you now is, so do you think it's because we're kind of treating all customers the same, like we're segmenting them in their own way? Because there probably is quite a lot of heterogeneity in these outcomes, right? So even within this group that you're saying that, we observe the kind of decline in financial well-being, there's probably a group that still benefits, but because we're just looking at the whole thing. What is your take on all this personalization argument and,
It's a great question. Personalization works in a fairly rudimentary sense.
But back to this resource thing that you mentioned, right? So obviously if you personalize, it becomes more expensive.
Yep.
So you really want to customize, but you want to customize to a cohort.
That's right. But the question is like, how do you personalize? And typically personalization will be done behaviorally. Someone has done X, therefore they've got a high propensity. Someone starts an activity and they don't complete it, let's personalize the message. Like that's fairly rudimentary. There'll be like some kind of propensity model, which to some degree is inverted commas personalized. That tends to be around messages. And so I'd be keen for your thoughts on this. In a lot of ways, like personalization to me feels like a means to an end. How do you create the right experience for the right customer at the right time in a way that's going to drive some kind of meaningful outcome? And so again, there's a lot of hard work to say, like, what's the outcome that we are trying to drive? And I think part of this comes, you said heterogeneity. I struggle to say that. Like as an academic, you've got that.
Yeah, sorry.
One of the things that I think tends to be fairly untapped, and this is the advantage of running a robust experiment with a clear behavioral theory. If I go back to the trade-offs experiment, what was interesting is that the effects around retention and usage were even more pronounced for customers with a second credit card. And so straight away you can then start to think about, well, should we be talking to customers with a second credit card slightly differently to those with a single credit
card?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then you're starting to go down some really high value theory-led approaches to the way that we should be thinking about different types of customers rather than just pure demographics, which is what occurs. The other thing that was interesting that we ran this experiment around tax time, and what was quite interesting is there's a control, there's a generic message to say you've got a tax refund. Then there was a challenge which said you've got a tax refund of X amount of dollars, and the encouragement was to increase savings. Now, what ended up happening is that for both of the treatments, the savings was fairly similar. However, when you looked at the heterogeneity, customers with a lower income actually overspent as well. So there are some interesting effects that were going on which you wouldn't see if you didn't do this subgroup analysis. And so again, that's an example of how do you be purposeful in terms of like the personalization that you're doing. And so it tends to be thought of in a very rudimentary way, but I think it ends up being a little bit of a flywheel as well. When you do robust experiments, you can figure out what works. I mean, one of the things that I will say is the second most important question is in the world is, did it work? Mm-hmm. The most important question, what's the meaning of life? But we don't talk about that.
But doesn't depend how you measure it, right? You can
the
always.
Meaning of life?
Well, no, I mean not the meaning of life, but did it work, right? Because it depends
Absolutely.
on what you benchmark, right? You can always say, well, this worked, this didn't work.
Absolutely, and so this is one of the challenges is if organizations don't think through what did it actually mean for this thing to work, and that's hard. But then once you've got that result, you can say what worked by how much, for who, for how long, and why. And that's where a lot of the benefit of running an evidence-based program works, is that now you've got a way to start to scale some of the insights that you got. It's not just a quirky, gimmicky experiment where you saw a button increase some kind of conversion on something, but you can now start to scale that to other parts of customer funnel, to other parts of the organization, where you can start to 10x the benefit that you're driving.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about this sort of also the narratives, because well, in my experience, obviously, and I think this is probably the most common question that I get myself, so I'm just going to direct it straight to you.
Please. Let me have a sip of caffeine. Just to...
No worries. Yeah, so I just wanted to ask you about kind of how do you justify that to the board, right? So effectively, we need to always show that if you're using some of these like behavioral methods or any other emerging methods, really the board needs to understand the results. And very often you would have people who will run with some really bad analysis, frankly,
Yes,
right? And
yes.
give it to the board, and the board.
What do you
is
mean
like,
by bad analysis?
well, like, giving people some outputs of research with customers where like they talked to two people and came up with two types of customers or something. And the board is sitting there and it's like, yeah, well, that was done, properly. So yeah, like how do you actually, like, what is the best way to justify that to the board that, you have the right method?
Such a great question. I'm deeply passionate about this. And I think what happens in a lot of organizations, and it's not intentional, but there's a lot of investment in delivery and engineering, but not much effort or expertise in causality. So what ends up happening is that there'll be a PowerPoint that gets created that with a strong narrative that gets cascaded up an organization. In a lot of ways, like the rational incentives where as leaders want to be able to share good news. And so they will find it relatively easy to share that good news, even if it's based on poor causal inference methods. So one of the most effective things I found, and this is new to a lot of organizations, is I'd rather show rather than tell, rather tell a story than just show facts. And so this is where it can be really helpful to counter some of that hindsight bias to say, what do you think of, here's something we did. So come up with a really great example, identify early adopters and pockets within an organization, actually run what's being described with strong causal inference and a robust control. And then regardless of the results, just presenting it and say, what do you think happened? And that will usually surprise people. They will normally get it wrong. One of the things one of the common mistakes is to say, which do you think performed better, A or B? Inherently, people have a 50-50 chance.
Okay.
So if they get it right, then they feel very,
you want them to
feel very
speculate.
smart. I'd much prefer they speculate. So I'll ask open-ended questions. Sometimes I'll ask slightly misleading questions where, so for like, I explained to you what do you think the relationship between financial well-being and digital engagement is? Open question, that revealed something. And so that can open their eyes to the fact that a lot of these things may not be as simple as they appear to be.
Yeah, so I think, this is like really interesting topic, how do you present, sort of scientific outcomes. Well, I remember I had a collaborator in financial services who could basically turn we would bring him like really sophisticated analysis, and he would turn it into beautiful bar charts and like just, one sentence kind of slides that would deliver the message very clearly to the board. So that was, I think it's like skill in itself to translate the methodology from science to someone, on the board.
And I think on that, what's one of the things that I've observed, and it's similar for product management and agility and behavioral science, etc., is the reality is that people don't care about the thing you're doing. They care about the thing they think it's going to give them. So in this case, you can talk about agility or product management or behavioral science or AI or whatever. Ultimately, what do they care about? They care about some customer outcome that will lead to some incremental increase in revenue or a cost reduction. That's ultimately what they care about. So all of that's really a means to an end. So you need to find a way to communicate it in a way that makes sense to them in their language. So if I just go back to the trade-offs example, because we've been speaking about it, one of the ways that I like to frame that is, once people see that, and the reality is that when I ask a lot of organizations, would you talk about the downsides of your products? 80 to 90% of the audience will say no, of course, that totally does not make sense. But when they see the results, it's a real light bulb. But more than that, I would say, imagine you put a business case together and you promised that you were going to drive an 18% increase in retention and a 13% increase in usage of a product, what do you think the reception would be? And the reception is typically like, that's overblowing it. That's really not going to work. You need to dial it down. But that just talks to the need to communicate some of these in commercial terms, which is ultimately, I think, what matters within organizations.
Yeah, and sometimes I think people also overcomplicate things. I recently saw like really good analysis, but it was, I think, segmentation analysis, and people came up with like 16 types of customers. And I know that they're like right, but you probably could have like still like generalized it to like 4, you know, because like when you have 16, it's overwhelming really, and like you don't want to have 16.
Totally. Yeah, and it's one of the things that I talk about is like, particularly those in the organization who are less experienced talking to senior leaders, they can be technically correct, but like narratively incorrect. So you ask them, did this thing work? And they'll say, well, you know, at the start of the week, we got some numbers and this, and you know, there are some caveats because this funnel goes to here, and you know, and like just, we need to find a way to like be narratively correct in a way that cuts through that. And so trying to separate, like if you're having it, like I would love to delve into like the technicalities of talk me through this initiative, what actually happened so I can try and assess it. But once you're speaking to decision makers, probably the narrative is the thing that needs to occur.
Yeah, I just want to say that Grant is really great at presentations, and we worked on a project together, and he completely rewrote my slides. Yeah.
You're too kind. I'm a product of corporations. I'm very familiar with the way they think and work.
Yeah, that was brilliant. So great learning experience for me of how to present present to that type of audience.
Every time I would talk to you, I feel a little bit dumber because so much fun. But I think that's where this and we were talking about this before. There's this magic of organizations have the scale and customers and, you know, these good intentions, but they don't necessarily have strong theory and causal inference. And so academics bring a lot of that. So bringing that together can be really powerful if, you know, there's a real meeting of the minds. And so like some of the examples that I cited are classic cases of that where it was just beneficial all around. So I'm a huge fan of academic partnerships and the huge benefit they can bring. You've got very smart people.
If they work right, if those partners.
Absolutely. And so part of it's a little bit of a language barrier as well. Like one of the things that I think I do okay is trying to translate between,
you're great at this,
between the two different parties. But that's where a lot of the fun is. Like it's very, very interesting just hearing about people that spend a lot of time thinking about very important things.
So I remember, especially like in my projects on cybersecurity, I would previously go and try to explain to people like how cybersecurity is cool, but it's such a dry and boring subject. Yeah, everyone is like,
just drifted off.
Yeah, whatever, right? Yep. So now I don't do that anymore. I just come with a business canvas and I explain, okay, here's where cybersecurity is making you money, here's where it's losing you money, and like this is why you should care, right?
I mean, I think what's interesting, I've found this, is that when you start to bring like a level of robustness, and you know, the way that I think about experiments is, you know, in a lot of ways I think about John List, one of my favorite behavioral economists, and he speaks about this idea of don't say the E word, as in don't say experiment. You know, you might say proof of concept, you might say a trial. I would actually say it's about just accurate measurement. All we want to do. Now, technically, we want to roll out some new feature with a randomized control that's representative, the clear theory, etc. But the way that I would talk about it is simply, we just want to make sure that the $5 million that you've spent is actually working, and we can accurately assess that, not just to like some rudimentary metric, but just to see if it's driving incremental revenue for you, etc. And so I think part of that is in the framing. But what happens if when you use that robust analysis is you end up competing with a lot of PowerPoint packs that don't use that. So you'd be or you may not be surprised, the number of business cases across organizations in the world that would claim to drive 5 or 10 or 20% uplift in revenue, and yet the size of the organization has remained the same for the past 10 or 20 years. And so what's clear is that all of the promised benefits are just not materializing. And so when you go and you present to a board or to decision makers about cyber, you're competing with a lot of PowerPoints that have inaccurate and inflated numbers. And so that's one of the challenges that I think needs to be navigated as well.
Well, I have a vested interest, so I'm going to ask you. I really like where you're going with sort of return on investment and all of that. So I'm going to ask you about technology, obviously.
Love it.
And well, in experimentation, especially A/B testing, there is a lot of there's now hype about generative AI and how we can now generate customer personas and ask them questions and all of that sort of thing. So what's your take on this? Like, is it really worth spending money on? Or?
Well, you're smarter than me, Gunnar, so I would love your take. From my point of view, I think, I'll sound a little repetitive here, but it tends to be, is that all of these things should be a means to an end. A lot of times they will be, I talk about this idea around the phase 2 problem, and most people don't know what the phase 2 problem is, but it comes from this episode of South Park. I've not watched South Park a lot, but there are these gnomes that are collecting underpants. And when confronted around why you're collecting these underpants, they show these like 3 steps. Phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, question mark. Phase 3, profit. And the reality is they don't know how they're going to get to profit. They don't know the link between the thing they're doing and the ultimate outcome. And in a lot of ways, organizations kind of suffer from this, that it'll be initiative X in phase 1, phase 2, question mark, phase 3, profit. And you can think about this with AI. It'll be like AI, thing, something, profit. And no one's really thought through the link between AI or generative AI or any kind of initiative and how it's going to materially lead to profit. It can seem very convenient on a PowerPoint deck, but thinking through that is really critical. And so those things can and should drive meaningful benefit, but they tend to enhance an existing initiative. So if you've really got data and you're running robust analysis, maybe you can run it in 1/10 of the time. Maybe you can do a ton of regression that you wouldn't have done previously. But anything that sounds magical in a phase 2 sense, I've learned to become very cautious about. Mm-hmm. I'd love your thoughts because you're very familiar with this space.
Well, I'm very excited about digital twins, obviously, but I mean, you don't have to use necessarily AI models in digital twins. You can just do a simple, logit model or, any robust statistical model. Yeah, so, but the fact that we can simulate outcomes without actually experimenting, this is quite exciting, I think, because you don't have to run 16 treatments of experiment. You can just run 2 or 3 that you triangulated on with
I'd be interested because I did see a paper last week which someone sent me a paper that was talking about some of this, that a lot of, maybe it was like sociology experiments could just be done using AI. And I was wondering about the contamination, the validity of that. I'm always a little cautious because I imagine it's just referring back to previous studies. And one of the things that I certainly learnt is a little bit of behavioural science knowledge is very, very dangerous. And so the longer you're in the field, the more you start to question replication and you question internal and external validity of experiments. And does this thing that occurs maybe in a lab actually extrapolate? Because we're referring to it, the credit card trade-off experiment, does that replicate to like a savings product, for example. And so I'd be a little cautious of that, but I'd be keen for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, the funniest thing that I heard like last week, I was at a panel where a person who's like really has quite a few projects in Australia running with the different types of analytics came out and said, oh, you no longer need to do like a pulse survey. You can just do synthetic data. And I was like, under no circumstances I would like outsource customer opinion to AI. Like it's just, like I always want to know what the customer thinks, like, and I think the pulse survey is very good. So yeah, I mean, there are these extremes, but don't you feel that I think this is like a little bit like, I feel that there are these two camps. Like one camp is like, we are the developers, which I mean, I'm probably one of them who are like really excited about stuff. And then there is a second camp who are more like towards ethics and law, who say, well, there are dangers of AI is going to kill you one day. We're going to have these killer robots, terminators, and all of that sort of thing. But then, I think the truth is probably like I'm always this like Dalai Lama in the middle, you guys.
The Dalai Lama.
Because it's like AI is a tool, right? So like if you have a kitchen knife, you can cook something with it, or you can go kill somebody. But you kind of choose what it's going to be. And equally, probably with behavioral science methods, it's the same, right? We can have really positive impact on people's lives, but at the same time, we can have, what is it, Isaac called it, weapons of mass influence kind of argument, right? So you can really damage people with it.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, and I remember doing this assignment on the ethics of behavioral science, and I was a little contrarian because I was saying we should really think about the ethics of either not doing behavioral science or not doing it well or not measuring effectively. And so in some ways, I know there was a bit of controversy years ago with Facebook and some of the experiments they're running around happiness and things like that. I'll just turn that off. I'll try and permanently turn that off. I know Alex will kill that.
It's okay.
So Facebook running these experiments around the impact of like the feed on happiness and depression and things was interesting. So it was very prominent, got a lot of press, but organizations are doing things today and not understanding the impact of what they're doing. So to me, the biggest ethical issue is you're doing a ton of stuff, but you actually don't know the impact that it's having. I think in terms of something like AI and the excitement, I remember the early days of the internet where, .com boom, the first wave came with an over euphoria, over optimism. And then the second, third, fourth waves were very transformational. So I wonder if there's a similar thing here where the first wave is overhyped. So we overestimate what the impact is going to be in the short term, but we underestimate what the impact is going to be in the long term. And I wonder if we can even see those second, third, fourth order magnitude.
So what's the future, do you think? Because I'm obviously very excited about the whole behavioral data science, but we also have a lot of these arguments that behavioral science is in crisis. And you are a recent student, so I'm assuming you discussed that in class.
Oh, totally.
So what are the hot topics, I guess, for private sector and for academia in terms of I guess behavioral science?
I've become convinced that applied behavioral science can 10x outcomes. So I've seen it. This is not theoretical. I know that there are questions about replication of things, is something externally valid, etc. I've literally seen it work. So I've become convinced because I've literally seen it work and I've seen it scaled. And you're really just scraping the surface. So it should fundamentally change things. But I think a bit about this within the area of like product management with a guy like Marty Kagan, who 20 years ago was talking about a product-led organization, which really shifts from a project-led to much more persistent teams driving outcomes, empowering them to understand customer needs and the viability within a business and the technical feasibility, and continuing to drive that innovation. And he's been speaking about this for 25 years. And recently I heard him talk about the fact that he is surprised that he still needs to talk about it. So the caution inside me is that the best organizations will do what we're describing, applied behavioral science, an evidence-based approach, outcomes at scale. That's a huge competitive advantage. You'll be able to prevent a ton of waste. You'll be able to drive all these fundamentally different products that perform much better. But a lot of organizations struggle to adopt it. And I think there are a bunch of reasons for that. But that gives me a little bit of caution.
Mm-hmm. But so do you think it's a bright future, or it's going to be?
It's definitely a bright future if it can be applied and applied well. I mean, one of the things that I was fortunate to co-lead a behavioral product owner program with UTS and CBA, and one of the things that I learned fairly early on around the idea of a little bit of knowledge can go badly is that people can overestimate their level of understanding when it comes to a behavioral theory and applying it. Mm-hmm. And it takes a lot of time, effort, and patience to do that well. And we tend to overestimate what can be achieved in a fairly short period, but with the persistence of a team for 3 or 4 or 5 years, you can drive significant benefit. But you need to be much more, you need to be very deliberate and cultivate the right environment as well. You need the right incentives. If you've got organizations that are primarily focused on delivering output and hitting milestones and not knowing whether they drove the intended outcomes, then that will just continue to persist. And I imagine in academia, you'd be the exception, but there will be parts of academia that produce a lot of research that's maybe is not that useful, but they continue to provide output.
That happens, obviously, yeah. But yeah, I think it's a good, it's a good thought about this whole thing that it should be, robust and underpinned by some sort of theory. But yeah, one thing that, I wanted to say about AI, it doesn't give you really any theory. It's a tool.
Yep.
So it can only be employed with some theories and models that come from another field, which, in behavioral economics, for example, would be economic models, or behavioral science models would be psychology models and things like that.
Yep.
So yeah,
I imagine it could get you, and I think this kind of goes to the idea around be really clear what the theory is and the outcome. If you're really clear on that, then it should be able to get you there faster, more efficiently, in a more powerful way. But if you've got no clue, it's like in the early days when people will look at a dashboard. If they don't have a clear question in mind that they want to try and answer and a clear metric that they think will help to answer it, you can be there for weeks.
Well, you can just go that looks cool.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I've seen data analysis done for 3 months where people haven't had a clear theory. They just kept asking questions and hoping that there would be some kind of light bulb.
We call it fishing expedition.
Fishing, yeah, exactly. So it ends up being a waste of time because people haven't really thought through what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, I mean, thank you so much for this. I know your time was very valuable, but one thing I'm going to ask you at the end is our audience, they really like to read.
Yep. So
they always ask me, and anybody I invite for some advice on what can we read. So can you recommend some books to read?
Yeah, I can. I mean, the starting point, and like I say, I've been fortunate to talk to a ton of people across a range of organizations, and typically a good starting point, I know you said read, but actually you might want to listen. Something like Choiceology by, just remind me of the...
Well, it will be in the description. Choiceology, okay.
Choiceology is a great podcast. Of course, John List, my favorites, behavioral economist, The Voltage Effect, The Power of Experiments by Max Bazerman and Mike Luca. The other thing that I've found awesome just to stay across what's happening is Twitter/X.
X, okay.
That's very active for a bunch of very smart academics and a bunch of really interesting threads. A lot of papers are first published there, and you can see a ton of interaction as well. One of the key things is just start using it. Be really quite. I mean, one of the caveats that I will say to people is the classic is choice overload, where people say there's too much choice overload. But actually, then you'd be familiar with the meta study around a choice overload and the fact that there are different effects in different contexts. And so I think for me, that's a real cautionary tale to say, understand where the theory is coming from, understand what the theoretical and experimental underpinnings are, to be quite clear on how do you apply some of these theories within the real world.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much.
Garner, it's been a pleasure.